Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Cretan, for that very nice introduction. I'm going to talk about, in a fairly general way, some of the threats and challenges happening with tropical forests. It's been encouraging to hear all the discussions about rewilding, particularly in places such as Europe. But of course, in tropical forests, which of course are the biologically richest real estate on the planet, we are still very much in a de-wilding phase right now. And we're facing many challenges. And there really is a tremendous need for wilderness in the tropics. One of the things that you see is that many species in the tropics are reliant on old growth forests, old growth rainforests. These are among the most ancient ecosystems anywhere on the planet. So the antecedents of some of these forests go back to the Cretaceous, to the time of the era of the dinosaurs. And they're very structurally, architecturally complex forests with unique microclimates and very diverse and complex plant communities. And as a result, given that great expanse of time, many species have become evolutionarily specialized for living in these forests, and they've developed many kinds of adaptations which require, in effect, wilderness. And not only that, but many species require large expanses of wilderness. Of course, we know about things like large predators, large carnivores, but also things like many large-bodied species in tropical forests. And even beyond that, there are other kinds of species such as migratory species. Many people are less familiar with the fact that many species that rely on nectar and on fruit in the tropics migrate up and down elevational gradients at different times of the year in order to find enough food resources. So many species of birds and bats and insects will do that, and they need a continual elevational gradient between lowland and mid-elevation and higher elevation areas in order to complete their life cycle. And if their forests are fragmented or degraded, that can be very difficult for them. There's many species of migratory fish in the tropics. There's some of the larger mammals are probably migratory in tropical forests. For instance, it's thought in Central Africa that forest elephants and buffalo may be migrating between coastal and inland areas in different times of the year. And also there's just many specialized species that are extremely rare in tropical forests. They specialize on particular microhabitats or particular resources, and as a consequence their populations are very, very sparse, and hence they need large areas in order to have viable populations into the future. And you see this strong pattern of dependence on wilderness, on old growth rainforest. When you look at some analyses, this is a paper that we published in Nature a couple years ago, and we did a meta-analysis of about almost 140 different studies, and we compared different kinds of land uses that were happening in the tropics. I don't know if you can see my little laser pointer here, but different kinds of land uses here, and this is the biological composition of old growth rainforest here, and the further away from this there's greater dissimilarity between these different kinds of habitats and the rainforest. And you can see here most of these abandoned agriculture and pasture land and degraded lands of various sorts, most of these are really biologically very different from the old growth rainforest. Now, there is one exception here that is actually quite close. This is selectively logged native forest, and I want to just take a little aside briefly and mention that although we're very much focusing here on the importance of rainforest, there's also some real conservation opportunities right now, because there's about 400 million hectares of the world's tropical forests that are in some kind of timber estates right now. The rate of logging is very, very high. For instance, about 20% of the world's tropical forests were logged between 2000 and 2005. And some countries like Indonesia have vast expanses of log forest, an area about the size of Germany. Unfortunately, even though these log forests have considerable conservation value, they are incredibly vulnerable to being converted into oil palm and wood pulp plantations and slash and burn agriculture. And so really, there's a lot of importance. We need to also focus on conserving these very vulnerable log forests, selectively logged forests, in addition to focusing on wilderness, although the main focus here is on wilderness. Another important thing that wilderness is doing in the tropics is providing some very vital ecosystem processes. One of these is the hydrological functions of the forest, particularly the evapotranspiration, the emission of huge quantities of water vapor up into the atmosphere. And if you look at systems like the Amazon basin and the Congo basin, where you've got vast areas of forest that are quite a long ways from the ocean, this water vapor effect is very, very important in the forest's ecology. The clouds that are created as a result of all that water vapor, the billions of tons of water vapor being emitted, are very important in terms of maintaining consistent rainfall, particularly during the dry season when these forests become especially stressed and especially vulnerable to fire. And also, those clouds are blanketing the equatorial region. And in most of those clouds, many of those, particularly at lower altitudes, are reflecting solar radiation back into outer space. And as a consequence of that, they're helping to limit and mitigate the effects of global warming. So that cloud building function of rainforests is incredibly important. Rainforests also act like sort of a giant biological sponge. You can get thunderous rains in certain times of the year, and when you strip away the vegetation, when you denude the land, that water just rushes over the land surface into streams and rivers, and of course you can have catastrophic downstream flooding as a result. So that vegetation also plays an important role in mitigating and limiting flooding. And of course the forests are locking up hundreds of billions of tons of carbon in their living vegetation and in the soils, and when those forests are destroyed or degraded, a substantial amount of that carbon is emitted in the atmosphere in the form of greenhouse gases. Now, I think everybody knows tropical forests are facing incredible challenges right now, and as Cretan emphasized, one of the big challenges is the incredible, unprecedented expansion of roads and highways. We are living in an era when the world's last surviving tropical wildernesses are being penetrated by many different roads and highways throughout the world. And it doesn't matter where you go. You can go to Borneo, you can go to Sumatra, you can go to Indochina, you can go to the Amazon, go to the Congo Basin. Everywhere you look, just about, areas are under assault by all these major new roads. A recent study by the International Energy Agency estimated that by the middle part of this century, we're going to have something on the order of 25 million kilometers of new highways. That's not including unpaved roads, that's just paved highways in the world. That's enough to encircle the world more than 600 times, and that more than about 90% of those new roads and highways are going to be constructed in developing countries, of course, which is where the lion's share of the world's tropical forests persist. So the challenge is very much at hand in terms of trying to limit the impacts of this onslaught of development. This just shows you here an example of the Congo Basin. Now, I've always thought of the Congo, of course, as this vast wilderness, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, that type of thing. But in fact, when you look at some detail, you see that the Congo, in fact, is crisscrossed by a whole labyrinth of roads. And even if you look at areas that appear to be relatively road-free, when you look at higher resolution imagery, you in fact see that there's many roads, smaller roads, from industrial logging operations through those areas, just smaller roads. So the bottom line is, roads are expanding at an incredible rate. Now, it's not just the impacts of the roads, of course, it's the secondary or knock-on effects that are really so alarming. Roads, in many cases, are the first step, oftentimes to destructive processes. In many ways, they're opening up a Pandora's box of environmental problems. For instance, here you can see, this is in northern Bolivia, you can see in the dark here, the major logging roads, and in red are forest fires, and you don't have to stare at that very long to see there's a very strong correlation between where the roads are and where the fires are. This is some work by Marilyn Adini and colleagues, and it shows the dramatic increase in the incidence of fires in the Amazon basin as you get closer and closer to roads. And in fact, not only outside of protected areas, but the same effect even happens inside protected areas, although obviously to a substantially lesser degree. Roads are also facilitating large-scale colonization of areas by hunters and by miners. This is some illegal gold mining activity. I shot this out of a helicopter in Sumatra. If you have a moment, look at some of the recent footage of the illegal gold mining in Peru. Go into YouTube and look at some of the footage that people are looking at right now. That it's unbelievable, the scale of destruction and degradation that's happening as a result of this huge amount of illegal gold mining in places like the Peruvian Amazon right now. So there's great challenges at hand. Now, as a result of this sort of tsunami, of this tidal wave of activity and tidal wave of development pressure, our protected areas are also coming under, bearing various kinds of brunts from these activities. One of the things that we're seeing is that the lands outside of protected areas are being modified at a tremendous rate. For instance, this is a national park in certain aspects. In other cases, they're improving, but overall, they're hanging in there and doing a pretty respectable job. However, the other half are reserves, and typically these are the ones that are suffering from dramatic changes in their surrounding environments and also encroachment, and generally have poor protection, are not doing as well at all. You can see here for these various kinds of biological indicators here, the overwhelming trend is a negative one. So the bottom line, I think, as this tells us, is that we cannot ignore what's happening around our protected areas. We have to conserve the protected area, but we also have to manage the lands to try to maintain connectivity, to try to have more benign land uses insofar as we possibly can. It really does give us some indication of the tremendous challenges at hand. But the bottom line is there's very strong evidence that a huge component of the Earth's biological wealth in the tropics needs wilderness areas. They're simply not going to be able to persist without wilderness, and so very much we know what the challenges at hand to try to conserve some of the most biologically important parts of the Earth. Thank you.